again, everyone. Long time no see. I am Trevor Devall. This is Me, Myself, and I. This is a little supplemental series I'm doing that's going to address some of the behind-the-scenes elements of the supplements that I use during the show. A lot of you had asked about, how did the emulator work? How did the Perilous Wilds work? And the GM source books and all the stuff I used. So basically, before we get rolling into Season 2, and we are going to get rolling into Season 2, make no mistake, but I thought I'd address some of these things whilst I have some time on my hands, as I think we all do at the moment, most of us anyway. So I thought I would look a little deeper into some of the supplements I used, kind of do like a mini capsule review of some of the more major ones, just to answer some of your questions, to give you a sense of how these things actually work behind the scenes. So the first one we're using is, of course, the Mythic Game Master Emulator. This is the granddaddy of them all. This is the one that determines everything else, basically. We'll just kind of go through it. I'm not going to go through every page or anything like that. I'm just going to hit on what I feel to be sort of the most important things that I felt was necessary for my game and my show. So first of all, Mythic Adventures, there are 3 different kind of ways you can use this. One, you can use it solo, like I did during the story of Simon. Another way you can use it is in a proper live-action game where you're running a bunch of other players. It's really great for that. I use it all the time in my games with my friends in other cities where we get together online, or even here when I run games in person. Remember that? Remember running games in person? Remember being able to see other people in the real world? Anyway, it's a great tool because if I don't know what I want to run, if I don't have any ideas, if I'm like, I'm not sure what the adventure is going to be, the emulator saves me every single time. I just make some rolls and go with it, and boom, instant adventure. It's really great. It's a great tool. The other way you can play it, of course, is with everybody sort of cooperatively GMing themselves. I've never really done that. I'm not a fan of like too many cooks in the kitchen. I don't like the pass the stick kind of story game stuff, typically speaking. So I'm more of a, Viking hat GM. Anyway, this is a crucial aspect. The logic of, the importance of logic and interpretation. This is what makes my game different than your game, different than anybody else's game. This tool, the emulator, is entirely focused on your own interpretation of events. So your instinct, your instinctual response to what you see first is so crucial. You got to go with your first gut instinct. If you stop and think about it too much, you start to tie yourself up. So as a GM, you know what's possible, what's impossible. You know what is likely, what's not likely. You know the rules of the physics of your world, typically speaking. Logic and interpretation is so crucial because everybody's going to interpret things differently. Many of you had great comments on episodes of my show where you saw things happening differently. That's good. That's okay. Because in your version of the game, that's how it would have played out. But it was my version of the game, and so that's what you saw. Then we come to this, the fate chart. The fate chart really is the backbone of this game. You saw me use it all the time. I would roll percentiles, would look at my chaos factor, decide the likelihood, and then come up with a yes or no answer. So as we know, there are 4 possible results, okay? There's yes, there's extreme yes, no, and extreme no. How do you determine that? I am an adventurer, and I come to the door of the dungeon. And my question is there a monster on the other side? Well, that's when we go to the fate chart. It's based on a few things here. Chaos rank is the level of chaos in the adventurer's life, basically. It starts at 5, which is right down the middle. Chaos rank determines how often a question is going to result in a yes answer. So the greater the chaos rank, the more likely it's going to be yes. So you got to keep that in mind when you're asking questions. Like I did with Simon, I knew that if the chaos rank was super high, that was going to mean a yes result. So I wanted to phrase my questions in such a way as to provide an interesting result, okay? So you've got the chaos rank here. It goes from 1 to 9. And then you've got the odds. The odds, again, are totally up to you and your interpretation and logic based on the events of what's going on. 50-50 is the baseline, obviously, but sometimes it's going to be obvious. And you saw it in my show, again, where it just seemed like, no, it's impossible that this could happen, or that's a near sure thing, or, oh, I think it's somewhat likely. Basically, it's just an instinctual response. It's a gut response. You go with it. You assign an odds. You roll against the chaos factor, and then you get something. So if you have a likely odds and your chaos factor 7, then you get this string of numbers here. So what we have is 18, 90, and 99. What this means is if I roll on those percentile dice, if I roll between 1 and 18, that's an extreme yes. If I roll between 19 and 90, that's a yes. 91 to 98 is a no, and 99 and 100, that's an extreme no, okay? But let's say that I said that the odds were very unlikely and my chaos factor was 3. Well, here, now if I rolled a 1 or a 2, that's an extreme yes. 3 to 10 is going to be a yes. 11 to 82 is going to be a no, and 83 to 100 is an extreme no. So you can see the higher your chaos rank, the more likely you're going to get a yes result, okay? So that's basically how that guy works there. Now, the second part to this is the part that I love the most. Random events. You can use this kind of in 2 ways. One is if you just want to ask a question that isn't a yes or no question, like, what is the nature of that NPC's motivations, for example? Or what's the reason behind this strange weather that this valley is experiencing, right? Then you can roll a random event to give you a sense of, an explanation. The other way you can use it, of course, is if you roll doubles anytime you're asking a question on the fate chart, and the number of the doubles is equal to or less than your chaos factor. So if it's a chaos factor 6, then 66, 55, 44, 33, 32, and 11 all would indicate a random event, which you immediately determine. So what we do here is we determine, the first thing is the event focus. So right here, we've got the event focus table. So if I roll doubles, what's the event focus? Well, you can see there's a whole bunch, right? Remote event, NPC action, introduce a new NPC, move toward a thread, move away from a thread, close a thread, PC negative. PC negative was a very, very common one in the story of Simon, if you recall. PC positive, ambiguous event, NPC negative, NPC positive. All of this allows you to focus the narrative so that you're not just creating willy-nilly, out of the ether, right? So that's the first thing you do. What's the event focus? You roll a 23, and 23 in this case would be an NPC action. Okay, so we know that of the list of NPCs, and we're going to get to the list in a second, out of those NPCs on that list, one of them is going to take an action. We don't know what that action is yet, which is why we go to the next page. Event, meeting, and subject. Action and subject. This table, action and subject. This one is my favorite table. So you determine your event focus. In this case, it's NPC action. And then you determine your action and subject. It's an NPC action. What does that mean? Well, let's say he rolls, the action is 23 and 46, okay? So 23 is judge, and 46 is food. Judge food. You can also phrase it as judgment of food, right? You can do that if you want, if that helps you. Judge food. Well, I don't know anything about an NPC right now, but for me, judge food would depend on the situation. It would depend on the NPC you're talking about. If you're talking about an NPC that's, let's say you've hired a hireling and you've got an NPC with you and the random event comes up, judge food. Well, again, it's all situational. It depends on what context the players or the characters find themselves in. Judge food could mean that this character, this NPC, has decided that he's going on a hunger strike until he gets paid more. Or it could mean that he becomes violently ill, or because of something he ate. Or it could mean that he's decided he's not going to eat what the cook is preparing at camp that night because he's suspicious of the cook. The sky's the limit, and it's all about your interpretation of it based on the logic of your situation. So it's all context-based, okay? It's an incredible tool, and again, it established so much of the baseline story for Simon and company. Then we get into the adventure here, scenes, and the setup and lists, and this is really crucial because if we look way down here, this list is how you organize everything. This list is how you keep track of the players, of the characters they meet, of the things that happen to them, and what's going on in the scenes, as well as the chaos factor, okay? So lists are composed of characters, okay? So all of the NPCs and all the PCs go on that list. Anytime you meet someone new, they're added to the list. So the first time that Simon met Mord the Orc, who he found him in that cabin, I think in episode 2. Mord became a character on a list. And Mord came back later because he was on that list in episode 4 or whatever to save Simon outside the Temple of Thurzan. Anyway, so you've got the list of characters. You've got Chaos Factor, of course, which we already talked about. And then you've got threads. Threads are story threads. Threads are things that come up naturally that you think this is now important to the characters in some way, and they're probably going to want to follow that. Or maybe it's a story thread of something happening in the background, right? Like at one point in Simon's story, there was a story thread about Sherilyn's group, the group of undead hunters that were going after Edbert. That was a thread that, was early on added to the list. At any point, that thread could have been acted upon. At any point, we could have seen, move toward a thread as our event focus, or close a thread, or anything like that. As it turned out, it never happened. But it was there the whole time. So story threads are how you always move your game back to sort of a centrally focused narrative. So it's not like you're writing a book. You're not railroading yourself, so to speak, down one, the players must do this thing because this is the thread. But the threads are literally that. They're like threads wafting in the air that you can grab and go, let's weave these threads into a much greater tapestry. So you set up the scene, and as you saw me do in the show, one of the things you do first is to decide if the scene is altered. So the first thing you do is you sit down and you say, okay, what is this scene all about? Simon has just walked into the town of Hundatora. He's decided to go to the inn and look for help. Okay, we know that's the perceived opening of the scene. But now we determine, based on the chaos factor, whether that scene is modified or altered. And that's what this is here. You can either alter a scene or modify it. Alter a scene or interrupt. And you roll the d10 against the chaos factor. If you roll the chaos factor or less, then the scene is changed in some way. If it's an odd number, then the scene setup is modified into an altered scene. But if it's an even number, then it's an interrupt scene. So if my chaos factor is 6, if I roll 5, 3, or 1, that means it's going to alter the scene. But if I roll a 2, 4, or 6 on that d10 before the scene, that's going to interrupt the scene. What is the difference? Again, it's a matter of interpretation. For me, an altered scene means the scene plays out very similar to the way it was going to, but there's some aspect, the most logical aspect, that gets just twisted a little bit. And again, you go with your first instinct on that. An interrupt scene is a random event. It's something that comes out of the blue, and you determine it exactly as you would a normal interrupt scene. You roll the event focus, then you roll the event action and all that stuff. And then you play out the scene and see what happens, and that's where the actual game bit comes in. And then at the end of the scene, however it ends, you update your list. So you add characters or you subtract them if people got killed or are no longer part of that story. You determine your chaos factor, and how that works is if you feel that the main characters were more or less in control of that scene that just happened, then the chaos factor goes down. If you feel that they were more or less out of control, then it goes up. Again, what does that mean? It's totally up to you, your interpretation of it. And then you update your threads. You remove the old threads that get closed and add new ones that come up. So that is basically the entirety of the emulator. The author goes on here to talk about various specific edge cases and gives a really great example of how this whole thing can play out. There's a chapter on world creation here, and then a bunch of Q&A questions here, which is fantastic. Tips for better play. And then a great extended example of Chapter 8 that really goes into all of the details of this. It's really well worth reading it. So that is the emulator. That is the main thing that I use to tell the story of Simon. And ironically, it won't be the thing I use in Season 2, because in Season 2 we're using Ironsworn. And Ironsworn, I don't actually need the GM Mythic emulator, because Ironsworn has its own GM emulator built into the game. In fact, I'm going to try to use no other supplements in Season 2 other than the Ironsworn book, which the author was wonderful enough to send me a copy of, as well as the Delve book, which is about dungeoneering, and all of the cards that are helpful to play the game. So I'm thanks a lot for that, man. Super excited to start that. So that's the emulator. I hope that answered some questions about how things work. When we come back in our next little supplementary series, we're going to talk about I think Perilous Wilds, which is a Dungeon World supplement, but one that I drew upon fairly regularly, but I drew upon mostly for dungeon crafting and stuff. Anyway, thanks for watching, and as always, hit like and subscribe and notifications and blah, 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 blah. Stay safe out there, and we'll see you next time on our Me, Myself, and I supplemental series. Okay, ciao.